I remember one time being interviewed by a Fox interviewer, and it had to do with Iran. And I wanted to bring up the subject of history. Don't you know, I told the interviewer, don't you know that we invaded or we participated in a coup and got rid of Mossadegh in Iran and started all this mess, and that's why we're still fighting with them? And he cut me off. I didn't even get to say that much. He cut me off. He says, I don't want to hear anything about history.
No, I do not fear them as you do, as many do, because they want another war. They want to spread this war. This has been the plan by the neoconservatives to have this major overall, this revamping of the whole Middle East, precisely the reason the Al-Qaeda is growing. The Al-Qaeda is growing because of our policy. Our national security is threatened because of our policy, and it makes it much worse. So I see the Iranians as acting logically and defensively. We've been fighting the Iranians since 1953. We overthrew their government through the CIA in 1953. We were allies with Saddam Hussein in the 1980s, and we encouraged him to invade.
All right, so I just want to get
Iran.
We don't need a history lesson, but I do want to get this on the record.
You have to.
So that is true. They don't want to hear history. I think we should learn from history.
As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No. A man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Three American troops were killed by an overnight drone attack in northeastern Jordan, and this drone attack happened Saturday night into Sunday. And these are the first Americans to die by enemy fire in the region since President Biden threw the U.S.'s weight behind the Israeli massacre of Palestinians in Gaza. And this is something I've been warning about for a while. With the sheer number of attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria, it's just a matter of time before an American died. Now, this happened in Jordan, and it was right over the border. It's right near the Syrian border. This base that was targeted is called Tower 22, and right across the border is the Al-Tanf garrison, which is one of the main U.S. bases in Syria. And this base, Tower 22, supports the U.S. occupation of eastern Syria. So on top of the 3 U.S. troops that were killed, over 30 were wounded, and the Pentagon has indicated that number could go up. So since mid-October, U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria have come under attack over 150 times in response to U.S. support for the Israeli slaughter in Gaza. This attack in Jordan appears to be the first time that this base, Tower 22, was targeted. President Biden released a statement blaming the attack on Iran-backed militant groups, referring to Shia militias that operate in Iraq and Syria. Later in the day, Biden said the U.S. shall respond, but he did not specify how. So there's some confusion about this. A lot of people think that this actually happened in Syria because a spokesman for the Jordanian government said initially, no, this didn't happen on our territory. It happened across the border, targeted the Al-Tanf base. But then later in the day, Jordan released a statement that did say it happened on their side of the border. The statement, this was put out by the Jordan News Agency, and it's been picked up by other places since. It says, quote, Jordan condemned the terrorist attack that targeted an outpost on the border with Syria, killing 3 U.S. soldiers and injuring 2 others from the U.S. forces that are cooperating with Jordan in countering terrorism and securing the border, end quote. Oh, now the response. How is Biden going to respond? This is the big question. There was a report in the New York Times last week that said, just like me, President Biden and his top aides, referring to Blinken and Sullivan, they believe that it was just a matter of time before an American soldier was killed. And that report said that if an American was killed, they would have no choice but to attack Iran directly, even though they certainly have plenty of more choices than that. So this is definitely a real concern that they attack Iran directly over this. Now, it's worth pointing out, this is very important, that there's no evidence Iran is involved in these attacks. Everywhere you read, they call these Shia militias that have been targeting the U.S. Iranian-backed. But the U.S. has said it has no evidence that Iran is directing these attacks. And there was a U.S. official told CNN a few months ago that it was always a persistent intelligence gap how much these groups operated independently, meaning that they don't know. So that's the thing is that they don't really know. But they're going to say Iran-backed, Iranian-backed, just to make it stick. And so I think there's a few possibilities here that Biden retaliates by targeting the Shia militias in Iraq or Syria again. He could respond by targeting Iranians, the IRGC in Iraq or Syria, or he could respond by bombing Iran directly. And I think either one, killing the Iranians in Iraq and Syria or targeting Iran directly, could mean full-blown war with Iran. Nearly 30 bipartisan members of the House have sent a letter to President Biden urging him to get authorization from Congress before launching more strikes against the Houthis in Yemen. So this letter was led by Representative Ro Khanna, Democrat from California, and Warren Davidson, a Republican from Ohio. And they said that President Biden was violating the Constitution by launching this new war against the Houthis. They said, quote, "We believe the U.S.'s unauthorized strikes in Yemen violate the Constitution and U.S. statute. We ask that your administration outlines for us the legal authority used to conduct these strikes, and we urge your administration to seek more authorization from Congress before conducting any more unauthorized strikes in Yemen. As representatives of the American people, Congress must engage in robust debate before American service members are put in harm's way and before more U.S. taxpayer dollars are spent on yet another war in the Middle East. No president, regardless of political party, has the constitutional authority to bypass Congress on matters of war," end quote. I bet if Biden does choose to bomb Iran, of course, he's not going to try to get authorization from Congress. He's just going to go right ahead, and they're going to claim somehow that it's self-defense. So this is another article from Kyle Anzalone, and it says that the newly installed Ukrainian defense minister has uncovered over $200 million in corruption during his first 4 months in his post, and his predecessor was dismissed over corruption allegations. And this is Rustem Umerov. He's the new Ukrainian defense minister. And he announced that an audit had uncovered $262 million in corruption. And the one example that he cited was a Ukrainian official who paid $40 million for 100,000 artillery shells that were never delivered. So it's embezzlement. And, this is just what the Ukrainian government is telling us. I think they have to, just because of the corruption is very well known and obvious, that they have to, at least come clean about some of it.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
Here's the out for Israel is that, they were going to obviously go, well, there are a bunch of anti-Semites over there at the UN. They're getting in the way of Israel protecting themselves. And before, they might have had a hell of a claim until this news story came out. And I'm not even weighing either one of these ones. I'm just telling you how ridiculous the UN is, that they're wishy-washy on whether or not they want to label something as genocide. And they won't even tell people to pause their military engagements on something that they think might border on it. And then you can police your own behavior just to document to us that you're not. Man, that's a lot of authority there from the United Nations. But then there's claims. This is from the New York Post. Someone sent me an article from the Times as well. I think it was Steven. I haven't actually read that article, but this is from the New York Post. The United Nations aid agency staffers accused of taking part in Hamas October 7th terror attack on Israel included some who provided rocket-propelled grenades, as well as other who actively killed and kidnapped Israelis, according to a damning dossier of intel given to the U.S. At least 10 of the 12 fired last week by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency were active members of Hamas. Why they were only just fired, and that's the extent of culpability here, man, the UN really is not very good at enforcing things. While another was affiliated with the Islamic Jihad, according to the dossier obtained by the New York Times. Israel officials said they tracked down the movements of UN aid workers on the day of the attack using phone records and phone calls, as well as using the agency as cover. The terrorists also work by day as terrorists and even teachers and other school employees, according to the dossier, which gives names for the staffers that were published by the New York Times. And now this is unbelievable. You want to just talk about how both sides are wrong and just Jews and the way that they behave. And over the weekend, UNRWA's Commissioner General Felipe Lazarina argued, I guess that's the organization, I don't know what that stands for, but that's the organization that turned out was working with Hamas terrorists that were involved in October 7th. UNRWA's Commissioner General Felipe Lazarina argued it would be immensely irresponsible to sanction an agency, an entire community it serves, because of allegations of criminal acts against some individuals, especially at a time of war displacement. Isn't that incredible? You have an organization that hired terrorists, was working with terrorists, and it's not one. I mean, how many people do you even work in the region that you had 10 of them, and you're going to tell other people that something that they're doing is irresponsible? Now, listen, I'm all for not punishing everybody on the account of the behavior of a few people, but to go and say that what anyone else is doing irresponsible when you had been hiring terrorists and I guess giving them, some sort of cover in that they're pretending that they're actually there for the UN, that's quite the spin. Now, back to bad information on Israel. You see, that's what happens over here. We actually give all sides of the story. Where is Hamas getting its weapons increasingly from Israel? They keep saying, hey, we can't send in water. We can't send them food. We can't send in any sort of aid because whatever we send in there, they turn into terrorist supplies. Well, it turns out the majority, or at least a lot of the weapons, according to this New York Times, is that Israel sends in all of these weapons, and then sometimes they're sending in such a high volume of rockets, some of the rockets misfire, and so most of the supplies that Hamas gets to then fight back against Israel is actually the misfired rockets or other bombs. Let's read a little bit. Where is Hamas getting its weapons increasingly from Israel? The very weapons that Israeli forces have used to enforce a blockade of Gaza are now being used against them. For years, analysts have pointed to underground smuggling routes to explain how Hamas stayed so heavily armed despite an Israeli military blockade of the Gaza Strip. But recent intelligence has shown the extent to which Hamas has been able to build many of its rockets and anti-tank weaponry out of the thousands of munitions that failed to detonate when Israel lobbed them into Gaza. According to weapon experts and Israeli and Western intelligence officials, Hamas is also alarming its fighters with weapons stolen from Israeli military bases. Interestingly enough, I've also heard that a lot of the casualties of Israeli soldiers is friendly fire. So between the two, doesn't it seem like Israel's making a bit of its own mess? All right. And then last, in terms of growing and escalating warfare, you've got these Houthis. They're out in the Red Sea. They're making it so that it's super expensive for all of our allies to ship the materials that we need. Remember when everyone was freaking out about toilet paper? Well, you talk about selling a war when you start seeing empty shelves and it goes due to the activity of Iranian-backed militias. We're unable to get you these supplies. Remember when it was Putin's supply line issues? Next batch of inflation. You're going to start hearing about how it's Iran's fault. But here you have out in Jordan, Biden says U.S. shall respond after drone strike by Iran. Back group kills 3 U.S. troops in Jordan. See, you finally they killed 3 troops in Jordan. That's what gets the U.S. to go, all right, now we're going to have to do something. And this to me, it's like the U.S. is basically standing around and going, we're trying to have a casual war here. And now you're trying to turn this into like a full war relationship. We're just trying to do the casual bombing here, there, and the next thing. But if you start doing these things and staying in the morning and fight, you're going to end up with a full war here. And that's why I just don't have casual wars. It doesn't work. It's like you sleep with the lady too many times at your place. You're now in a relationship. That's the way it goes. If you're going to be over in the Middle East, just think that you're going to just casually bomb things here and there, and you're going to casually be over funding a war against Russia without fighting them. At some point, it's going to escalate into an actual war. That's the way these things go. No one's okay with just casual bombing. They're like, hey, you want to have this war or not? And then I love this spin. This is world-class spin right here. I saw this headline from the Washington Post. This is their way of selling the current situation out in Russia. U.S. doesn't anticipate big gains by Ukraine against Russia in 2024. You see how they keep it on the positive? That's great sales. It's not, hey, yeah, we're going to keep funding them and they can't possibly win this thing. It's they don't anticipate big gains. There might even be little gains. How's that for spin? We got to keep sending money over there. They don't expect big gains, but it's not like they're losing.
Don't tread on us. I want to start with the definition of social justice, because flimsy definitions is how they can justify the passage of any law. When I'm talking about social justice, I'm referring to justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within society. The central premise of social justice, the reason it's so dangerous, is the built-in assumption is that all disparities within society are the result of discrimination or injustice, and the solution is for one group of people to have a monopoly on violence to rectify that injustice. It's completely counterproductive. It divides people based on rich versus poor, black versus white, American versus Russian. Even in the last couple years, we saw old versus young. You want to get a job and enjoy your life? Well, you just want grandma to die from COVID. Get the mask on and get the vax and go back inside. So switching from arbitrary divides, age, gender, nationality, the true divide that the Free State Project does such a great job in promoting are the people in the world who achieve their ends through voluntary exchange and those who achieve their ends through violence or threats thereof. This assumption is, by the way, held by almost all university professors, the Democratic Party, many Republicans, corporate marketing campaigns, Hollywood, and basically everyone in the corporate press. So, I want to start off with a little trivia. What do the following names have in common? Dylan Noble, Margarita Victoria Brooks, Robert Sycon, Chad Michael Breinhold, Daniel Schaefer, Zachary Hammond, Tony Timpa, Kelly Thomas, Justine Damond, Ashley Babbitt, and Duncan Lemp. What do those names have in common? Unarmed whites murdered by the police. Now, if you are a social justice advocate, what's really important is the race of these people. If you are one of us, you realize that the central issue is some people claiming the right to initiate violence against others. I didn't think of wind in an outside speech. Okay. In the case of Kelly Thomas, a homeless man diagnosed with schizophrenia who lived on the streets of Fullerton, California. He died 5 days after being severely beaten by 6 members of Fullerton Police Department, who he encountered on July 5th, 2011. Medical records show that bones in his face were broken and he choked on his own blood. The amazing thing is this is all caught on security camera. On January 13th, 2014, Ramos and Cincilli were found not guilty on all charges, while the trial for the third officer, Wolf, was pending. The case of Tony Timpa. On August 10th, 2016, Tony Allen Timpa, an unarmed 32-year-old man, was killed in Dallas, Texas by police officer Dustin Dillard. Officer Dillard pushed his body weight onto Timpa, for 14 minutes after he was already restrained. Again, all on his body cam. And officers ignored pleas from Timpa that he was in pain and was afraid he was going to die. Timpa's death was ruled a homicide due to extreme physical exertion. Cops were not arrested. This is an example of why this should not be a racial issue at all. But unfortunately, the corporate press makes it so. If you type in the name George Floyd into TikTok, you can get 5.4 billion views of all the views from all the videos with that hashtag. If you spell his name wrong, you get 4.4 million views from the collective videos. The name Tony Timpa yields 0 results. People think it's about race. It's a complete distraction. So, all I gave were anecdotes. What about the science? I can hear Tony Fauci screaming in the distance. July 2017, a man named Roland Fryer, one of the youngest economists to get tenure at Harvard, published an empirical analysis of racial differences in police use of force throughout 18 cities. His conclusion: on the most extreme use of force, officer-involved shootings, we find no racial differences in either the raw data or when contextual factors are taken into account. Washington State University published the reverse racism effect. Are cops more hesitant to shoot black than white suspects? Turns out, according to them, police were 3 times less likely to shoot unarmed black suspects than white suspects. We need to not make this a racial issue at all. Findings summarized by Wilfred Riley of Kentucky State University. Serious empirical analysis done by everyone from myself to the Manhattan Institute's Heather McDonald to killedbypolice.net, an entire web resource set up to study this topic, invariably concluded that fewer than 1,200 people of all races and sexes are killed annually by American police officers. In a typical year, such as the representative year of 2015, roughly 250 of these people were black. It's true that the black percentage of individuals killed by police of 22% is slightly higher than the 13% representation of blacks in the US population. However, this roughly 10% gap is wholly explained by the fact of black crime rate, violent crime rate, arrest rate, and police encounter rate, all significantly higher than the equivalent for other races. There is no evidence for any of the Black Lives Matter claims. It turns out, Skeptic Magazine asked people, how many unarmed black men a year? I mean, we've seen Eric Garner, that absolute tragedy, George Floyd. How many times a year does this happen? Overall, nearly half of surveyed liberals, 44%, estimated roughly between 1,000 and 10,000 unarmed black men were killed, whereas 20% of conservatives estimated the same. In 2019, the Washington Post found 41 unarmed people were killed by police, 9 were black, 19 were white. Another example of why we should not have this disparity as something to focus on. Turns out, same Washington Post research, an overwhelming majority of people shot and killed by the police are male, over 95%. Nor should we make this a sexism issue. More than half of the victims were between 20 and 40. Reject ageism, reject sexism, and reject racism. The progressive sees, okay, we get one group to have a monopoly on violence. They give you orders, you have to obey them. You don't obey them, they have the right to shoot you. And they're like, oh, I bet this is about skin color, isn't it? They're completely missing the entire principle of the issue.
Step 1 of the story, before the friendly fire and the embellished atrocities, is the absolute disarray in which the Israeli military leadership and internal security force leadership found themselves when, Hamas just completely pwned them, first of all, through all of their high-tech surveillance equipment and through their breaching the gate or the fence around Gaza at so many different places. And this seems to be the consensus in the media. I don't know if it's a limited hangout, but it seems like the people in charge really had no idea what was going on for hours and hours and hours. Is that your correct understanding too?
I mean, that's definitely what the Ynet article says, and it certainly seems credible. It was a known thing among people that follow Israel's security that they had become increasingly reliant on technology. And, there are those of us, including myself, that are skeptical of being too reliant on technology. So there was always the risk that it would fail in this fashion. But, what they describe is absolutely incredible. They talk about how they were in Israel's main command center that they call the pit. They were relying on public TV news reports, on Telegram channels. They were going to the WhatsApp chat groups of kibbutzes. People were calling personal friends to get targeting information. It's absolutely out of control. And yeah, even 6 hours in, they didn't know what they were facing. And I mean, I think it must come back to a high degree of incompetence. But, with governments, it's really hard to read where they are on the incompetence evil matrix, because usually governments are some combination of both. But I really don't think that, I'm not one of these people that believes that Israel wanted this to happen and intentionally let it happen for an excuse to, attack Gaza, especially because they never seem to struggle to find an excuse to attack the Palestinians if they're so inclined.
Yeah, you got that right. And, it's just kind of looking backwards at it that people say that, and it makes sense on the face of it. And yet it also makes sense that what they're doing now is a massive overcompensation for the complete and total failure of the Netanyahu doctrine, right? It's not just something bad that happened. It was the entire scheme that fell apart. And so now the prime minister needs a new and different legacy. If it isn't going to be lasting Abraham Accords, it's going to be some new beachfront property in Gaza or something.
Yeah, so something that a lot of Americans don't realize is that Israel actually has a very robust media environment. I mean, it's all primarily Zionist, but, they're really highly critical of their government. They do really good investigations. There's a lot of really good dialogue. And yeah, there have been many people saying that this shows how bad Netanyahu's policies fail, that their, fortress state idea itself has failed. A big one, too, is that, they, because of internal political issues, they won't clamp down on settlers in the West Bank that keep, basically doing pogroms against Palestinians. So they had moved a bunch of their units to the West Bank to protect Palestinians instead of just arresting the settlers. So they weren't even guarding their border properly. That's what gets me is people keep saying Israel has a right to defend itself. And it's like, oh, yes, they should have done so then. Like bombing civilians in Gaza is not defending yourself.
Yeah, it's Brad Pierce. The Wayward Rabbler is his blog on Substack on Anti-War Radio here today. And we're talking about his piece, A Hannibal Directive by Any Other Name. Brad, what is a Hannibal Directive?
Okay, so in 1986, there was a famous kidnapping in Israel where an IDF soldier was taken into Lebanon. And so they set up a protocol that basically says that they're allowed to put an IDF hostage's life in danger in order to stop the kidnappers from taking them, back and being held hostage. And the way the IDF would describe this is that this, for example, allows you to snipe out the tires of a car that they're fleeing in, which sounds reasonable. And, they will specifically say it never has allowed you to do an airstrike, that would kill everyone in the car. It's never allowed you to, it never applied to civilians. It never authorized killing, Israelis in any way. The lead ethicist of the IDF's code of ethics, called it unlawful, unethical, and horrifying that they intentionally shelled this kibbutz berry, it's called, where they, shelled it with a tank knowing 14 people were inside. Anyway, it was always highly controversial in Israel. They argued about it for, 30 years, and then it was allegedly repealed in 2016. But they replaced it with something that the public, the text has never been made public. So we don't know what their current actual protocol is. But within Israel, it's now quite widely considered that, at least in some instances, they, followed this and decided that it was better to kill the hostages instead of dealing with them being hostages.
Talk about the different reports about the helicopters firing on the people, because the way I read that, the most incriminating paragraphs really talked about them firing at anybody coming out of Gaza. And then I guess there was a bit about them hitting cars headed toward Gaza. But the new Ynet story, I forget if the original thing I had read was Ynet or not, but the new Ynet story sheds more light on that. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the original story was from Haaretz, and I have to admit that I thought that Max Blumenthal went too far extrapolating from this at the time. And it just basically said that some of the people at the Nova Music Festival were hit by helicopter fire. And, that could easily be a good faith accident in such a, hot, difficult situation. But later they gave an order, to the helicopters to kill anything that comes within our territory. And I read that to not mean, our territory as in Israel, but our territory as in the section that, you're controlling right now from the air. And I mean, that's basically a kill anything that moves directive. And then they said that they later claimed that the Hamas people had been trained to not run from the helicopters because it would cause people to think that they were Israeli civilians, which, I mean, that hardly makes sense except as an excuse for having shot a bunch of people that you shouldn't have or something. But yeah, so that was their claim. And it does seem as if they just assigned the helicopters just not leave anything alive within the space they were covering.
Mm-hmm. So to go back to what Hamas actually did, you write in this article, I think you make a pretty cogent point that possibly all the embellished atrocities that they came up with. I think you're saying in here, if I read you right, that they didn't need to embellish all of this stuff just to get away with what they're doing in the Gaza Strip. As you said before, they do what they want anyway. They come up with an excuse for that. They really did it in overcompensation for their implementation of the Hannibal Directive. This is really what they were changing the subject from, was the Hannibal Directive, which if the public had found out immediately about that, things might have been quite different.
Do we know for sure who or what killed 3 American soldiers and wounded 34 others at this place called Tower 22 out in the desert in Syria or Jordan or Yemen, depending upon which side of the border you're on at the moment?
I do not, but CENTCOM does, the Central Command. The intelligence out there is so good that they have to know where those rockets or missiles came, or drone charges came from. That means that if CENTCOM tells the truth, we might get to the bottom of this. But CENTCOM's reputation has been that they tailor the intelligence to suit the policy, And no one was more guilty of that than General Lloyd Austin when he was commander-in-chief of CENTCOM, when he lied through his teeth about successes by the moderate rebels in Syria. So it's the same complex. It all depends on whether there are any honest analysts left at CENTCOM. And I would remind people that 50 CENTCOM intelligence analysts and DIA analysts, the Department of Defense Intelligence Agency, 50 of them went to the Inspector General of the Pentagon complaining about how their intelligence was being doctored and falsified at the very top by, guess who? General Austin. And there was an IG investigation, and of course it was done by a one-star, Austin being a four-star. You know how that came out, okay? But that's unprecedented. 50 intelligence analysts. I wonder if there are any honest ones left down there at 10 CENTCOM.
I mean, could this have been, I suppose the answer before I even say what I'm asking is yes, because anything is possible. Is it probable that this was a false flag, either by the Israelis or the Americans, or some entity wanting to start a war there and make it look like someone else's fault?
Well, if you look at cui bono, I mean, it was very clear. Even the New York Times about 10 days ago said the president is really interested in making sure that we prevail there. And if an American soldier is killed, well, then, okay. So the warning was there. Whether it was a false flag or not, I give it a 50-50 chance. As you know, Judge, I've been thinking that the Israelis will resort to this in any case, and they would be supported by that part of the coterie in Washington that we rightly call the neocons, the people who see no difference between the interests of Israel, and the interests of Israel are paramount right now, and the interests of the United States. So I don't know the answer. CENTCOM does. I just hope and pray, hope against hope, that the analysis will come up and not be doctored this time and not be used as a casus belli to go after Iran.
What, in your view, is the likelihood that the U.S. will overreact and this will expand or widen the war? And if that happens, it might be to Prime Minister Netanyahu's delight if the U.S. is involved in hostilities in his neighborhood.
That's correct. He would delight in it. Now, Larry and I were talking with you just on Friday, and Larry mentioned that hopefully some saner heads would prevail in Washington, saner heads that would say, Mr. Biden, if you attack Iran and this spreads, that's the end of Israel. I believe that to be true. That would be the end of Israel, because even though Iran is not working on a nuclear weapon and doesn't have one, it has such an array of sophisticated missilery, and so does Hezbollah, that would be the end of Israeli cities. Now, that would be a sane voice in the mix. Are there any? I think Larry had to admit, I can't identify any. So what's the answer to your question? It's more likely than not that Biden will authorize a kind of a strike that will try to provoke Iran into an open exchange. I still think that the Iranians have been playing this really cleverly. They're on the winning side of all this with the Houthis, whether they control them or not, and with others that feel strongly about genocide. I think the Iranians would be able to restrain themselves and not rise to the bait and get involved in open conflict with the U.S. It would depend on what the U.S. does. If Senator Graham has its way, yes, there'll be open war.
Big picture now, your 50 years, maybe longer, of observing all this. How do you explain the American lust for war? Remember that famous one-liner, no matter who you vote for, for president, you end up with John McCain.
Well, Judge, it's the feeling of, the antiquated feeling now that we can do what we want to do and we will prevail. We've always prevailed. Since World War II, since the fall of the Soviet Union, we've always prevailed. Now, the most recent manifestation of this was President Biden himself when he turned to that 60 Minutes interviewer and he said, huh? We can't prevail on two fronts? Come on. We're the United States of America, the most powerful nation in the world. In the world. You understand that? Now,
pretty good imitation, Ray, and verbatim, as I recall it. Go ahead, please.
I'm persuaded that he really believes that, and that Biden and Sullivan are not up to saying, we've just found out, Mr. President, that, it's a little different now. We can't work our will, especially in the Middle East. We're still losing, and Ukraine is going south. So let's trim our sails here and figure out how we can deal with these things rather than have it go really south and take an overt defeat in both areas. I don't know if there are any wise people around that could tell them that, and that is really the problem.
And I am talking today about the Supremacy Clause, an introduction to Article 6 of the Constitution, something that it seems like everybody's talking about a little bit these days, but almost everyone seems to get it wrong. They ignore or miss part of the Supremacy Clause, and it gives it a whole different view. Here, for example, from Cornell Law School, they say Article 6, Paragraph 2 of the U.S. Constitution is commonly referred to as the Supremacy Clause. It establishes that the federal Constitution and federal law generally take precedence over state laws and even state constitutions. So it's basically the general concept that as long as the federal government passes something, it takes precedence over state law all the time. And really, most people just really kind of read it like that. They say federal law is always supreme, or federal law is always supreme if the states try to do anything that conflicts with it or interferes or gets in the way, anything that even remotely looks like the states are doing something that the feds are claiming the power to do, it's automatically federal law is always supreme. But this couldn't be more wrong. And I think it's important to start out by reading this paragraph from Article 6 of the Constitution, and it says, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding." So, the key phrase that everyone seems to miss, here's how Mike Meharry puts it in an article, Understanding Federal Supremacy. He says, absolute federal supremacists tend to completely ignore three key words in the Supremacy Clause: in pursuance thereof. And you can see it in the text there. It says, all the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof of the Constitution. And you go back to Cornell Law School. This is a leading law school in the country, and they don't say about pursuance thereof. Their lead sentence is federal law just generally overrides state law. Meharry continues. He said, the clause does not read, "This Constitution and any old act Congress decides to pass shall be the supreme law of the land," but that's how most people read it. Only acts, Mike writes, within the scope of the federal government's delegated powers rise to the status of the supreme law of the land under the Constitution and the Supremacy Clause. William Davey in the North Carolina Ratifying Convention put it this way: it can be supreme only in cases consistent with the powers specially granted and not in usurpations. So federal law is always supreme as long as it is in pursuance of the delegated powers of the Constitution, and there's not a ton of those. We also have some of the top legal minds. For example, James Iredell, who was nominated to be one of the first associate justices on the Supreme Court by George Washington. Here he is in the North Carolina Ratifying Convention. He says, what is the meaning of this? Talking about this Supremacy Clause. There was some debate about this in North Carolina specifically. He said, what is the meaning of this? But that as we have given power, we will support the execution of it. That's the description of what they are saying, why they did this. So if you're going to have the federal government have the ability to do stuff in a certain sphere, it has to have the ability to just do it. That's the whole point. He said, we should act like children to give power and deny the legality of executing. You can read the whole thing. It'll be linked in the show notes, but it's a pretty nice take there. He says, then when the Congress passes a law consistent with the Constitution, it is to be binding on the people. If Congress, under pretense of executing one power, should in fact usurp another, they will violate the Constitution. Again, here's Iredell using the same type of language that St. George Tucker used some years later in 1803. This is July 28, 1788, in that North Carolina ratification debate. He said, look, if they go beyond that limit, this is usurpation. Usurpation is not just like, oh, we did a little overreach. I know a lot of people, when they talk about federal power, and I do this too, we talk about like, oh, here's some federal overreach. Like they just kind of pushed in a little bit too far. But usurpation is a much more powerful term, especially at the time. Maybe not today, because people don't really think in terms like this. But this is stealing sovereignty. Usurpation of power is a nasty thing. St. George Tucker also in that same book referred to it as treason against the sovereignty of the people. So an exercise of power that is not delegated is a usurpation. Here's Governor Johnston in North Carolina that same date. He says, I do not know. There was some debate over the use of the term pursuance, like, oh, this is hard to define. And he says, I do not know a word in the English language so good as the word pursuance to express the idea meant and intended by the Constitution. Can anyone understand the sentence any other way than this? When Congress makes a law in virtue of their constitutional authority, it will be an actual law. And the implication there is if they make a law that is not within their constitutional authority, it is not a real law. It is void, a usurpation of power. He says every law, this is again Governor Johnston in North Carolina, every law consistent with the Constitution will have been made in pursuance of the powers granted it. Every usurpation or law repugnant to it cannot have been made in pursuance of its powers. The latter will be nugatory and void. This is Hamilton, I think. He said, but it will not follow from this doctrine that acts of the large society which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers, but which are invasions of the residuary authorities of the smaller societies, will become the supreme law of the land. Again, even Hamilton, this is Federalist 33, which will be linked to in the show notes. These will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. And that gets a little bit into what I was getting at just a moment ago, talking about Iredell and Johnston. You know, if an act of usurpation is void, again, they're going to try to do this from time to time. The structure of the Constitution was supposed to limit that, at least for a period of time, according to Benjamin Franklin, and then eventually it wouldn't do it because you can't rely on words on paper to do the job. It's up to the people, and if the people are corrupt, then they're going to put corrupt people in power who do all kinds of nasty stuff. But ultimately, the way that you deal with an act of usurpation is you recognize that it is void. It is not law. It is not an actual law. It is usurpation of power. It is theft, and it deserves to be treated that way.
I keep trying to figure out the people that have control of our foreign policy, are they crazy or mentally ill or just what? Or are they conspiring to do something and they're totally naive? But anyway, their motivation, I like to talk about motivations. Why do they do it? What's the purpose of this? But there's a lot of them that I can't understand their motivation because it's so bizarre and so weird. And our foreign policy is getting worse. We need to work harder at what we're doing. The best we can do is expose what we see and give a suggestion that maybe a different approach would be better. And of course, if we talk about it and say anything, we get blasted for being isolationists. We don't want to deal with the world. We don't want to have trade and visits and travel. They don't accept the idea of non-intervention, which is what the founders believed in and advised us to do, saying that we would have a better chance for peace and prosperity if we just would mind our own business. But that doesn't mean we isolate ourselves. Matter of fact, it's the opposite. This is what we're doing. We isolate ourselves. Our foreign policy is isolating our country more than ever before. And yet they use a term that we're the ones who want to be the isolationists and pursue war. But the truth is otherwise, so we'll work on that, and we have a job for that. But there was a big event yesterday, and it caught the attention of all the media, though there's been events like this have been similar. They've been worse, but for some reason somebody needed a little bit of action, and the action, the media had got the action because that's all they talked about for the last 36 hours, and that is dealing with the 3 American troops killed in a drone attack in Jordan. Oh, I wonder what they were doing there.
Yeah.
I wonder if they were authorized to go there and start a war. We'll have to ask Biden.
Yeah, he'll know.
Why he sent them over there. But hey, 3 American troops killed. But not many people will ask the question of what in thunder are they there. But I think there's been a map around. I hope we get to see it showing where we are. I mean, it's so extensive. The only thing when I look at this, and I wanted to get discouraged, is I look at it and more people are saying, they're asking the same questions we are. Why are we there? Why are we spending money in Ukraine? At the same time, we could use a little bit of help on our own borders. But people are talking that way.
Yes,
so I would think that eventually truth wins out. But, there's the establishment that would deal with our wise professors, our media, most journalists, except for the few that we know, are all there to distort what's going on. And that is a real challenge. But this of course, is another example of what we warn about, things getting out of control, the unintended consequences, how long are they going to last, how many people die, how much money it costs, all these things. And, it's a shame to be right on this stuff.
Yemen and said, stop blocking these ships. And Yemen said, we're going to block Israeli ships going into Israeli ports. And Washington said, well, we're going to bomb you if you do. And they say, we don't care, we're going to keep doing it. And so that's the case here. And it will be the case in Iran, but on a bigger scale. We can't just tell people to jump and they say how high anymore. But nevertheless, they're pretending like the world hasn't changed. Let's go to this next clip because this is John Kirby, the spokesman of the National Security Council. And here is him saying, we have prepared various retaliatory options to respond to Iran's attacks. Now, it wasn't Iran, it was Iraq, okay, and presenting them to the president, waiting for his approval. We do not want to enter into a full-scale war with Iran, but we will take all necessary measures to protect our security and interests. And I would add, with the exception of pulling the troops out, which would actually secure them. But here's the point I wanted to make, and I made it in an update that I sent to our subscribers last night for the Ron Paul Institute. And that's if you look at this next picture. So the Hawks want the U.S. to bomb Iran now because Iraq sent in a missile to Syria to tell us to leave. Now, this is a map telling you all the American troops that are stationed within Iranian missile range in the region. And you're looking at about, I would say, 30 to 40,000 U.S. troops. If the U.S. attacks Iran over an Iraqi drone hitting American troops in Syria, these 36 to 40,000 Americans will be directly targeted by Iran in retaliation. It is such an unbelievably dangerous and foolhardy move that I think any member of Congress or any senator that suggests that it should happen should be drummed out of office for wanting to sacrifice this many troops.
Yeah, that picture you had up there is perfect to make the point that this intervention doesn't make any sense. It is aggression, and it's illegal, and it's far more than most Americans would think. You know, the Americans are waking up because they heard that we were wasting money in Ukraine.
Yeah.
But we waste money all over the world, and if anything settles down, we're ready to go someplace else.
Yeah.
I mean, this argument about the funding in the Congress right now, they're trying to get funding to make sure we can fight China.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That whole thing. But I keep thinking, and you made a point because you made the suggestion on who did what. Well, what if Iran actually didn't have a lot to do with this? I mean, they don't even ask the question because that would ruin their whole program.
Ruin the party.
We've taught people how to hate all these years. You know, we started off in 1953, and we're not going to let up. You know, until they behave themselves and become good Democrats. You know, that's what they're waiting for. So that is a shame, but it will come to an end because we have a bankrupt moral and financial system, and our foreign policy, it doesn't make much sense.